Hello, my name is Daniel Hill. I'm from the University of Liverpool, and it's my pleasure to give you a talk today on God, the meaning of life, and meaningful lives. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to start by a quotation from Professor Peter van Inwagen on the meaning of life. So van Inwagen writes in his book Metaphysics, "The term meaning has various senses, but none of them lends any sense to the question, what's the meaning of our existence, other than this sense? Explain why we exist in terms of the purposes that we serve. If Alice surprises a trusted employee that's broken into her office and is going through her files and asks that person, what is the meaning of this? She's requesting an explanation of a certain state of affairs in terms of the purposes of her employee or those whose agent the employee is." I think this is a terrific little quotation that encapsulates a lot of talk about meaning of life. To take a step back and think about the comparison in terms of language before applying that to life. In a linguistic context, the logically primary use of the word meaning is to refer to something that utterers have in their minds when making utterances. That's what I think. Secondarily, this may be extended from utterers to their linguistic acts, and then to the intended product of the acts, for example, written inscriptions. We could talk about the meaning of them, like a sentence written on a page. And similarly, I'm suggesting that meaning in the present context, the meaning of life, may be extended from the agent that created life to the agent's acts, the act of creation of life, and then to the states or events produced life that has been created. So to go to van Inwagen's example of Alice again, we may speak not only of what Alice's employee meant, but also of what Alice's employee's action meant and what the state or event produced by Alice's employee's action meant. Imagine then, to vary the example, that Alice discovered her papers were in a mess on the floor. She discovers that state and asks, what's the meaning of this mess? An answer to her question would consist in telling her that the mess is the result of a purposeful action, and what the purpose behind that action was. The mess, however, would have no meaning if it weren't the result of a purposeful action, if it had been caused by the wind, perhaps. It would also have no meaning if it had been caused aimlessly by conscious agents accidentally knocking the papers onto the floor without intending to, or by drunken or entranced agents throwing them on the floor without any ulterior motive. Now, back in 2002, I tried to apply this talk about meaning to the question of the meaning of life, and I wrote there in this article in Philosophy Now magazine, life has a meaning only if there's an explanation of it in terms of the purposes of an agent that brought life about. Therefore, atheists must necessarily deny that life has a meaning, since no overall complete explanation of the existence of living things could be given in terms of the purposes of any set of non-divine agents. Let me see if I can unpack that a little bit. Here's step one, the world. Now, by the world here, with a capital W, I mean the sum of contingent states and events. If the world has a meaning, then that meaning has to be a purpose that it gains from being an intended product of the purposeful action of necessary beings such as God. The reason for this is no contingent being would have existed beforehand to have endowed the world from its very first moment with meaning. And secondly, no contingent being, as a matter of fact, purposefully creates itself or even everything else, or even most of the things. I'm assuming, by the way, that simultaneous and retroactive causation are impossible. The second step of our argument concerns life, and I've put this with a capital L now. I should have really have done this back in 2002, but I didn't think of it then. So by life, I mean the sum of the lives of living things, just like world with a capital W is the sum of everything contingent. If life with a capital L has a meaning, then that meaning has to be a purpose that it gains from being an intended product of the purposeful action of a non-living being, such as God. This is because no living being would have existed beforehand to have endowed life from its very first moment with meaning. Secondly, no living being, as a matter of fact, purposefully gives life to itself, or even to everything else, or even to most other things. Once again, I'm assuming that simultaneous and retroactive life-giving are impossible. By the way, some of you might think, oh, non-living beings such as God. Well, the point is that God isn't alive in the sense in view here. Okay, he's not living in the biological sense that we've got in view. What about individual lives such as mine and yours? An individual's life could be endowed with meaning by their parents, on this understanding I'm suggesting. Parents, for example, may have a child in order the child could look after them when they're old. And in fact, a life can have more than one meaning, since a life can be the product of a joint action undertaken with different intentions. And a life can even have two meanings in tension with each other. Perhaps one parent decides to have a child to provide someone to go away and earn money, whereas the other parent decides to have a child to provide someone to stay at home as their full-time carer. You can't implement both those intentions at the same time. Now, more recently, Michael Hauskeller, my friend and colleague and the organizer of the conference at Liverpool on the meaning of life, gave some criticism of that argument from 2002 in some reading notes online. And he writes, quote, "When we ask about meaning in life, we're not really asking for an explanation at all. Instead, in many cases, what we're asking for is a justification. If life has a purpose, that purpose does not answer our question about life's meaning, or if it does, then not because it is life's purpose, but because it gives us a reason to live and to find our life worth living. The question we want answered is why we should live, or why we should go on living." And Michael Hauskeller also provided 3 counter-examples to my account. So he writes, if, for instance, God had created life to enjoy the spectacle of our suffering, then that would be the meaning of our life. Secondly, or if my role in God's plan were to amass the largest collection of bottle caps, then this would be the meaning of my life, however trivial collecting bottle caps may appear to me and to everyone else. Thirdly, if God had created us to forever rail rocks up a hill, only to see them roll down again shortly before we get to the top, then this would be the meaning of our life, even though such a life, the life of a Sisyphus, is widely seen as a paradigmatic case of a life entirely devoid of meaning. Okay, how do I respond to Michael Hauskeller? Well, I agree with Michael that there's a difference in meaning between, quotes, the meaning of life and the meaning in life, or life's being meaningful. The adjective meaningful seems stronger than the noun meaning. We normally reserve the adjective meaningful for valuable things, or actions done, or states of affairs, or events resulting from a valuable purpose. It doesn't normally suffice for an event to be called meaningful that someone brought it about just for some purpose or other. So here's an example from D.H. Lawrence's book Women in Love from 1920. Quote, "Gudrun paddled softly, lingeringly, longing for Gerald to say something meaningful." This isn't a photo, by the way, here of Gudrun, it's just illustrative. Gudrun would not have been satisfied by just any old utterance that Gerald uttered with some purpose or other. She wants him to say something with a valuable purpose, for example, how he feels about her. To carry on responding to Michael Hauskeller, I still believe that the meaning of the word meaning in what is the meaning of life, just as in what is the meaning of this, as Van Imwagen suggested, relates to purpose. Nevertheless, I agree with Michael Hauskeller that when people talk about the meaning of life, often, maybe usually what they really want is an answer to a different question, a question about what would make their lives meaningful. Here's the connection that I see between the two notions. In the first case, we look at the purpose with which life was brought into being. But when people ask, what's the meaning of life, they're often asking, is there a purpose that I should make my own for my life? To apply this to the example of Sisyphus that Michael Hauskeller brings forward as a counterexample, is there a meaning, in my sense, to Sisyphus's life in the underworld? Yes. The gods had a purpose, punishment, in letting him continue to live there. They could have destroyed him, but they decided not to, let's say. Now, is his task that he does in the underworld, pushing the stone up, meaningful? No. Sisyphus's task does not fulfill any valuable purpose in and of itself, and that's why it's been chosen for him. By the way, in and of itself is italicized because his performance of the task does fulfill valuable purpose, namely the purpose of justice. And that's why there's meaning to his life. Let's think about Michael Haskeller's other counterexamples. What if the life fulfills a purpose, but it's an evil purpose or a trivial purpose? What if my parents brought me into existence to have a bottle top collector, and that for its own sake, not for any further purpose? Or if sadistic parents brought me into the world just to see me suffer? Well, I'd be under no moral obligation to make those purposes mine, but what if in fact I did dedicate my life to one of those purposes? Then on my account there'd be a meaning to my life, but I accept Professor Haskeller's criticism that it wouldn't be a meaningful life. And this is because these purposes are not valuable, even if they're mistakenly valued. Now, what I want to do now is to apply what I said really in the first part about that 2002 article about the existence of God and meaning, the meaning of life, to the question of the existence of God and the meaningfulness of lives. So remember, I argued back in 2002 that atheism implied that there was a lack of meaning to life in general, life with a capital L. I do not say that atheism implies that no individual life is meaningful. That's why you can see I've struck through the entailment arrow there, the implication arrow. I don't think that. I think the atheist can consistently maintain that individual lives can be meaningful. Nevertheless, the most valuable activity possible, I assert, is the glorification of God. But I don't assert that the glorification of God is the only valuable activity possible. Why not? Well, Micah 6:8 states, "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Now, as a matter of fact, acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly do glorify a God. But my point is that acting justly would be good even if per impossibile there were no God. So the atheist can say, acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly are good things, and therefore they make life meaningful, the atheist can say, and I think that's a consistent position. So I'm not suggesting that atheism implies that no life is meaningful. This puts my view in a certain position in the taxonomy drawn up by Thaddeus Metz. Metz distinguishes two versions of supernaturalism, so my view is a variety of supernaturalism because I appeal to God, a supernatural being. Moderate and extreme supernaturalism. Extreme supernaturalism is this view: if neither God nor a soul exists, then everyone's life is meaningless. I do not assert that, I deny that. Moderate supernaturalism, this is my view, says if neither God nor a soul exists, then everyone's life could have some meaning, or even be meaningful, but no one's life could exhibit the most desirable meaning. My view is that glorifying God can and does make a life more meaningful. Indeed, it can make a life infinitely more meaningful, but it's not logically necessary for meaningfulness. So I deny extreme supernaturalism. As a matter of fact, I assert that sin prevents our lives from being infinitely meaningful before death, and my view is a version of moderate supernaturalism. Now, Thaddeus Metz has an argument in the paper he's presenting to the Liverpool conference that moderate supernaturalism is unstable. It collapses into extreme supernaturalism. This is what he says, quote, "On moderate supernaturalism, life without God would not be a flat zero, but it would, compared to infinity, come about as close to zero as is mathematically possible for a non-zero number." And that argument fails to capture the judgment that a life without God could be meaningful on balance, absent God and a soul. Just as we'd not describe someone's life as happy if it had only a smidge of happiness compared to what's frequently on offer, so we can't plausibly describe someone's mortal life as meaningful if it has only a small dollop of meaning compared to infinity. So that's why he thinks moderate supernaturalism collapses into the extreme version. Here's my response to Thaddeus Metz. I agree with Metz that we normally use the words happy and meaningful comparatively. I agree that we'd not call a life meaningful if it fell well below the average of meaningfulness. But there's a problem. The problem is that there are at least 3 different classes with respect to which one could make this comparison. First of all, we could be talking about the class of all possible lives, including lives in logically possible worlds without God. Secondly, we could be talking about the class of all actual lives, including those lived after death. And thirdly, we could be talking about the class of all actual lives in the here and now before death. And it makes a difference, I'm going to say, which of those we have in mind. If we adopt the most natural comparison class, the third, that's all lives in the here and now before death, then Metz's problem, I say, does not arise, because our residual sinfulness in this life, I say, prevents any of our lives being infinitely meaningful before death. So the difference between my view and extreme supernaturalism seems clear. No life is infinitely meaningful before death, and lives that attempt to glorify God but do so imperfectly are more meaningful, but only finitely more meaningful than lives that don't. Let's take a different comparison class then. Let's adopt the first comparison class, the class of all possible lives, including lives in possible worlds without God. Logically possible worlds without God. Here too, Metz's argument, I say, doesn't succeed. For any possible life you choose of finite meaningfulness, there exists a logically possible life, even one in a world without God, containing a life so meaningful, while still being finitely meaningful, as to make the one in question paltry in comparison. Same goes for happiness, to pick up on another word that Metz uses. So Metz's argument can't be applied in connection with this, the first comparison class, because it would forbid one from calling any possible finite life meaningful, because there's always going to be one that makes it look paltry in comparison. That leaves us with the second comparison class, the class of all actual lives, including those lived after death. I agree that Metz's argument seems plausible here, because I've said that we can have infinitely meaningful lives after death. But in order for 2 theories to be distinct, it's not necessarily that they give different answers to every question. It suffices that there's one question to which they give a different answer. And I think our consideration of the first class and the third class showed that extreme supernaturalism and moderate supernaturalism were logically distinct theories. So I reject Metz's assertion that moderate supernaturalism like mine will collapse into extreme supernaturalism. To conclude, I agree with Professor Michael Haskell that my argument from 2002, that the meaning of life is the purpose with which living things were created, does not answer the question that most people mean to ask when they ask about, quotes, the meaning of life. Nevertheless, I assert that the purpose that God created us to fulfill, the purpose of glorifying Him, is an important and good purpose. Indeed, there's no purpose more important or morally better. So I assert that if God exists, then glorifying Him is not only the meaning of life and of each life, but also can make each life meaningful, indeed infinitely meaningful, if lived in union with Him after death. Secondly, I don't assert that the glory of God is the only possible thing of value, and consequently I don't assert that atheism, or its close relative naturalism, implies that individual lives cannot be meaningful in the sense of being valuable and worth living. In other words, I assert moderate supernaturalism, not extreme supernaturalism. That said, if God does exist, glorifying God is so far and away the most important good that any life not aimed at fulfilling that purpose is missing out on being as meaningful as it could be. Any life not devoted to glorifying God looks, I say, paltry in comparison with the possibility of an infinitely meaningful life after death with God. Well, thank you very much for listening. Thank you to Professor Michael Haskell for detailed comments on 2 drafts, and thank you very much to Tim Mawson for comments, and thank you also to Thaddeus Metz for permission to quote. Thank you very much for listening.